Hello, and welcome to Politics and Prose bookstore. My name is Nicole Davidow, and I'm the marketing director here at the store, where we host all sorts of fabulous events, classes, trips. Everything can be found at politics-prose.com. Also, for the latest, follow us on social media. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that, too. Before we get started today, and speaking of social media, we don't want any dings and beeps going off, so just make sure your phones are on silent. It would be much appreciated. And when we get to the Q&A portion of the talk, we do ask that you try to make your way up to this microphone here at the pillar, because we are filming tonight's event. Without further ado, tonight I'm extremely excited to welcome Susan Orlean, celebrating the release of Joyride, a magic carpet ride through her life and career, where every day is an opportunity for discovery and every moment holds the potential for wonder. Susan Orlean has been a staff writer at The New Yorker since 1992. She's the New York Times best-selling author of 7 books, including the library book Rin Tin Tin, Saturday Night, and The Orchid Thief, which made it into the Academy Award-winning film adaptation. She lives with her family and her animals in Los Angeles and may be reached at susanorlean.com and on Substack at susanorlean.substack.com. Orlean will be in conversation with Marion Winik, the author of 9 books, including The Big Book of Dead and First Comes Love. Her essays have been published in the New York Times Magazine, The Sun, and elsewhere. Her column at BaltimoreFishbowl.com has been running since 2011. She reviews books for Kirkus, People, and The Washington Post, among others, and her NPR podcast is called The Weekly Reader. Please join me in welcoming these 2 wonderful writers to Politics and Prose.
Is this on? Yes. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming here. I'm so excited to be with Susan. We just figured out that we only met once before when we rode around in a golf cart together at the LA Times Book Festival in 2018. But now we get to, I was really excited to be asked to join her since I'm a huge fan of Joyride. And I've asked her to start by reading to us from the book.
Thank you, Marion, and thank you all for being here. This is, it's very funny. A few people have said to me, so this is your first memoir, as if there will be many more to come. I'm very curious about that. So here we go. And this is from the introduction to the book. I have journeyed in the land of giants, waving my pencil, dreaming. I dreamed of becoming a writer, and then I became one. And now I want to tell you why I wake up every day amazed by that fact. Writing has been the only job I've ever had, the only work I've done since 1978. It feels like I started yesterday, although I'm also aware of how many stories and books I've written and how many years have whipped by. Writing always feels new because you never build equity. Every sentence is a slippery invention, a bit of quicksilver I release to the world, and then it's time to invent the next one. That's why being a writer is never boring. But that's also why it's a little terrifying, why every time I've sat down to write since 1978, I wonder if this is the time I simply won't be able to do it and words will fail me. But so far, so good.
Thank you. I have to say that all 9 of my books are arguably memoirs, so it is possible.
Well, yeah, I'm sure. I think that it happens more often than I realize, that there are a lot of people who write multiple memoirs, and it isn't something that I foresee in my future, but I'm also not foreclosing that possibility.
You never know when you're going to have the year of living dangerously or something like that. So the title, Joyride, suggests both pleasure and recklessness. I really love the title, and I want to know how you chose it, and were there other candidates?
This book, like every book I've ever written, had other titles. In fact, every book I've ever written had a title that was like our placeholder that then got replaced with something kind of in the 11th hour. This book, to begin with, we called it True Story, and it really was just a sort of make do title for a memoir. And I never liked it, but I thought, it's okay. But as publication was getting closer and closer, there was a feeling of like, we've really got to buckle down here. We've got to come up with a title. And all of my titles have changed very last minute. So I knew that this wasn't the first time that there would be a last minute, like, wait a minute, we've got absolutely the wrong title. But I couldn't think of anything. I just felt like nothing was coming to me. Nothing felt right. I wanted it, I just didn't know what I wanted it to convey. That was the problem. I have had this picture that a friend of mine took on my computer desktop forever. And it's this picture of me riding in a bumper car. I think it's at Disney World. I'm not entirely sure. I don't really remember. But it's a picture that, to me, demonstrated absolute unrestrained delight because we were laughing our heads off and she took this picture. And somehow it just clicked. And I called my editor and I said, I've got the title, Joyride. And I didn't even break down why I thought it was such a good title until later. Part of it is because there's so many different meanings to that phrase. It's both the idea of a pleasurable journey. It's, the word joy and the fact that it's a ride, it had a lot of meaning. But also it has this other meaning, which is you hotwire a car and take it for a drive. And in an odd way, I thought, isn't that what writers do? Isn't that what nonfiction writers do? We kind of hotwire someone else's life and take it for a ride. So it all felt absolutely correct. And it was a huge relief because we were really designing the cover at that point, and I still hadn't, until that bit of inspiration, nothing had struck me as the right title.
It's really the perfect title. And I guess one other thing about it is, a joyride has no planned itinerary. And your career is like that. She did not have a 30-year plan.
Right. I think that the idea that it conveys is some amount of adventure, and fate will take me where it takes me. And I wanted that quality in the title. But of course, it would have been hard to think, all right, how do I sort of focus group a title that conveys those emotions?
Also, there's been so much of this, Joan Didion, I hate to write, but I love having written, Kenneth Tynan, all writers hate to write. I mean, we hear so much about how hard and difficult it is to write and how the writers don't like it, though they like the accomplishments and achievements. And you're clearly a writer that has gotten tremendous pleasure out of every part of the process. You make it sound a lot more fun than all these people that are so burdened by their incredible talent that forces them to, sit there and type. But I think it conveys something really different that people don't usually say about writing.
Well, and I will say, I think I certainly give plenty of column inches to the fact that it's a challenging profession. It can be very lonely. It can be very difficult. There are all sorts of ways that it is not an easy job to adopt. But I feel like if you don't embrace it as fundamentally a joyful enterprise, you're probably in the wrong profession. And I get it. It's sort of cooler to say it's miserable and you're miserable and life is horrible. And yeah, that's good. But maybe I'm counter programming and saying, you know what, it's kind of fun to say, gee, I think I'd like to climb Mount Fuji. And the next thing I'm doing is I'm climbing Mount Fuji. I mean, how is that bad?
Yeah. And, compared to like the loneliness of, say, Marcel Proust or something, you have had a career that's full of people and relationships. I love the part where you explain that a lot of times when you're doing a topic, you don't research it in advance, you don't find out anything about it, you just go there and start meeting people and forming connections and finding the way to the story through friendships and relationships and connections. So it's the life of a nonfiction narrative writer is less lonely than these poor novelists.
Right.
Yeah.
On the other hand, when I was working on my first book, Saturday Night, I came across a survey where Americans were asked what is the thing they feared the most. And the first thing they feared was swimming. And the second thing they feared was going to a party with strangers. And I thought it was really interesting because if you wanted to think of a way to describe the life of doing nonfiction writing, you're going to parties with strangers. And there are times when that is extremely difficult, really awkward. You're in a subculture where you're the only person who doesn't fit, you're the only person who doesn't know anyone, and it can really throw you back on your most sort of junior high school emotions of feeling awkward, feeling like you have no one to talk to, you don't know how to begin a conversation. It's definitely emotionally challenging. And I think a lot of people would find that absolutely like the last thing they would ever want to do. I don't love it, but I also find it kind of fascinatingly challenging. I am in a room with, 200 members of the Ashanti tribe who live in New York City. I'm the only person who doesn't know anyone. I'm the only white person. I'm the only reporter. I'm completely on my own. And oddly, I find it sort of exhilarating. How do I figure this out? Who do I talk to? How do I connect? How do I break through and start connecting with people here? The one thing that I've discovered is people are really kind. I think if you are the one stranger in a room full of people who all know each other, most people feel a great deal of sort of caretaking, that they want to make you comfortable. They're not going to turn away and leave you awkwardly standing there, shuffling your feet.
Maybe not everyone has had this experience. I think there's something about you that makes them want to do this. But, I was going to ask you, and it fits right in, because one of the most charming relationships that you form in the book is in the first story about the American man, age 10. And I wanted you to tell them about it and also talk about why you decided to start the book there.
When I first thought about writing this book, I considered the idea of taking one story of mine and just breaking it down to its fundamentals and explaining how I did it, why I did it, what were the steps that led to the story. That piece struck me as the obvious one to begin with because, well, let me give you a little backstory on the story, which, for what it's worth, we included in the book because I refer to it extensively and it ran long ago. So while some of you may have read it, we also thought let's include it in the book so you can read it and understand what I'm referring to. What happened was many years ago, and I, of course, now can't remember the year, Esquire magazine approached me and asked me to write a piece for the magazine. I'd never written for them before. They were doing a series on the various stages of a man's life. They had done a piece already about aging, and they now wanted to do a piece about adolescence. And their version of this was to have me profile Macaulay Culkin, who was 10 years old at the time. And, you know, it was exciting for me to get an assignment from Esquire, of course. I'd never written for them. It was a great magazine. But I thought, I'm not that interested in Macaulay Culkin. But more importantly, I didn't see how Macaulay Culkin in any way sort of represented a typical American adolescence.
Good point.
I thought he represents the adolescence of like 3 other kids, max. And so out of the blue, with no particular reason to think this was going to work, I just blurted out that I wasn't interested in Macaulay Culkin, but I was interested in the idea of a 10-year-old boy. And how about if I just find a very ordinary 10-year-old boy and write a profile of him? I don't know if I was expecting them to say yes. I have to think about that. I'm not sure, because when the editor said yes, I thought on one hand, oh my God, this is great news. And on the other hand, I thought, I don't know any 10-year-old boys. Like, how am I going to do this? But also, I knew that I had created a challenge for myself that was far greater than doing a celebrity profile. To be honest, celebrity profiles are very easy. The reader automatically has an interest. We all like reading about celebrities, and at the very least, you know why a magazine is running a profile of a celebrity. Writing about ordinary people, it turns all of that upside down. It is somebody who, by definition, doesn't have a life that's dramatically different from many other lives. So the question arises, why are you writing this? Why this particular person? What does it mean? Well, these were things I was going to have to grapple with. And I thought, all right, I'm profiling a 10-year-old boy. I got to find one. I began calling my friends. I lived in Manhattan, and I didn't know any children. I mean, I think there are children in Manhattan. I didn't know any. But I also didn't want to write about a kid growing up in Manhattan. It felt to me like such a particular childhood that wasn't typical. I wanted to write about a kid who lived in the suburbs, or a town that was more like the typical American life. So I began calling my friends saying, do you know any 10-year-old boys? And they were like, why? I mean, it was a very odd conversation. And eventually I found one of my friends knew someone who she thought had a 10-year-old and who lived in New Jersey. And to my delight, I went out and met the boy, and I said, I'm going to write a story about you. My idea is I'll come out and sort of live with you for 2 weeks, go to school with you, hang around with you. And I don't think he was listening. I really don't. I think if he was really listening, he would have said no. But he sort of said, yeah, like whatever. And having been the mother of a 10-year-old boy, I can say that's typical. It's like, yeah, whatever. And his parents said, well, if Colin says he'll do it, that's fine with us. I showed up at the appointed hour at 7:30 in the morning, because I was going to go to school with him. And I think suddenly it dawned on him that a full-grown adult female was going to go with him to school. And he absolutely shunned me. He's like, I just thought, oh my God. He turned away, would barely talk to me. Esquire had given me 3 weeks to do this story, and they had said, not to put any pressure, but it is the cover story, and all the other stories in the issue are already done. So, we don't want to pressure you. It is your first story for Esquire. So I'm like, yeah, no, oh, yeah, this is great. So this kid wouldn't talk to me. He wouldn't even look at me, let alone talk to me. I followed him to school. I was like 10 feet behind him, sort of shuffling behind him like a geisha. And we got to school. I squeezed myself into one of those little tiny chairs. Over the course of the day, I think he began noticing that his friends thought I was kind of interesting, like I was his show and tell project, and that was kind of cool. And I also think he could see the utter despair on my face because I was sitting there truly thinking, I am screwed. Like, I've wrecked this. I'm never going to write for Esquire again. This is humiliating. And not to mention that the story was going to be difficult no matter what. By the end of the day, I think he felt pity for me. I also think he figured out there's this adult who is sort of willing to do anything, and she has a car, and she's got some money. And she's willing to give me quarters for the arcade. And, I think he began seeing the way this could work to his advantage. So he kind of embraced me. At some point, I began feeling that he forgot that I was a grown lady and began thinking that I was another 10-year-old boy. And I wrote about this at some length in the piece because I really did begin to feel like, that we were horsing around and being goofy, and he had a friend over and they were like throwing things at me and being outrageous. And I thought they've forgotten that I'm an adult, which actually was fantastic. And, writing the piece to me was so meaningful because it was a statement about how a life of a kid who was like millions of other kids in America was actually fascinating, and that really we assume we know everything about, quote, ordinary people, but in fact we really don't. And to me, the world of 10-year-old thinking was so exotic and weird and warped and fabulous. It was one of the most interesting subcultures I'd ever explored. And it was a real relationship. I mean, I
You
have
really
to
kind of fell in love with him.
Yeah.
You do too, as the reader. You're like, it's so adorable.
I mean, he was just this wonderful kid. I have to tell you a funny story because this cracks me up. So to me, he will always be a 10-year-old boy. He's sort of preserved forever as a 10-year-old boy. So some time ago, his mom called me and she said, oh, I just wanted to say hi. And I thought you might want to know how Colin's doing. And I said, oh gosh, he must be like 12. And she said, Susan, he's 30. That was tragic, but
So that after you open with this like deep dive into that story, then you go back and go chronologically through your career.
yeah. So what I did in the book, because I had this idea of taking apart this story, what I did in the book is I began with this introduction and then I dove into that piece because I felt like this tells you everything about what I care about as a writer. But then it was like pulling a camera back in a film to say, okay, so how did I get here? Because you don't just land on the doorstep of Esquire and kind of have the nerve to say, I'm going to do this story that's not at all the story you wanted. So it gave me a chance to sort of rewind and start at the beginning and work my way toward that story. And sort of how I ended up there.
You say in the book that you often don't know what a story is really about until you're deep in the reporting. With memoir, where you already know the events, how did you discover what Joyride was really about? Was there a point where deeper themes revealed themselves that you hadn't expected?
I think no matter what, when you're writing, you are discovering as you're writing. This was a challenge on a couple of different levels because I knew the subject almost too well to have the discovery that I normally have. I mean, often when I'm doing a story, there's a point where I go, oh, now I understand why I wanted to do this. And that's always a huge piece of it, is this realization of why I wanted to climb Mount Fuji, why I wanted to write about the Ashanti king, whatever the subject is. So it was a little harder, besides simply saying I'm going to document my life, which you could say that alone is reason to do it. We're in a culture of lots of self-declaration. Here's who I am. Here's what I care about. This was, in part, I thought I really wanted to make my argument for why I've done what I've done, because I felt that we've sort of lost that desire to learn about each other. And it's become less and less. I mean, and I'm not talking about the shrinking of the world of journalism. I'm talking about an attitude of turning away from each other that felt really worrying to me, and that this seemed like a moment to say, wait a minute, there's an incredible wealth of excitement in learning about other people, that we've sort of forgotten that, and we have such a diet of celebrity and drama and true crime and things that are dramatic, but there's this other level at which there's a rich story to learn about each other. And so a lot of what I felt like I was doing was making an argument for why I've done what I've done and why I feel that it's important.
Okay, I'm going to ask a kind of a personal question, but would you have written this book differently if your first husband was still alive?
Well, I've thought about that.
Yeah.
I mean, very honestly, I've thought about that. And
I mean, I'm asking because her first marriage was tough. You tell them.
Yeah, I wrote at some length about the unhappiness of my first marriage, and then completely unexpectedly and at quite a young age, my ex-husband passed away. And you know, I had already begun writing the book, but I was still grappling with, I mean, I think this is a permanent issue in memoir. Like, how do you write? It is my story, but also you are writing about other people. You're sort of drawing them in regardless of whether they want to be or not. And I don't have an answer for you. I think it would have emotionally been very different.
Would you have, like, if he had been alive, would you have shared the manuscript with him, or
Never.
Never.
No.
Okay.
No. I mean, I just wouldn't share a manuscript with anyone.
Yeah, okay.
But I don't know what I would have done. I really don't, and I don't know that I don't have a good answer because it wasn't the case, and so I didn't have to finally think, oh, what am I going to do?
And it's not like you throw him under the bus or something. It's not like a mean-spirited portrait or a vindictive or anything like that. So there's that. It's just, it's hard to depict tough chapters and shared with other people.
Well, and what I think I can say, which is sort of the inverse, which is it was a whole lot easier to write that knowing that he was not alive and that it wouldn't hurt him, it wouldn't cause him any difficulties. But I I I don't think I wouldn't have written my book if he were alive. Would I have detailed it as much? I just don't know the answer. And I look at, people write memoirs. Oh my God!
I know.
I mean, people say
talk
stuff.
about mean spirit and throwing them under the bus. There's, this whole category of things called divorce memoir that can really be a problem.
Yeah, and it was really funny because before I started writing the book, I was reading the poet Maggie Smith's divorce memoir, and I was both fascinated by it and slightly horrified, and feeling like, wow, this is such a complicated thing, because she had every right to write what she wrote, but I kept thinking, it's her children's father who she's describing, and I don't have a judgment on it because I think it's so complicated, and I don't know that there's a right answer or a right way to go about it. I was lucky in the sense that I didn't have to grapple with it.
Well, from a plot perspective, it's really good that the reader gets to experience the loneliness and frustration of your first marriage, because it makes your second marriage so much fun when it happens, and you're like, you really feel like, okay, this woman is having this great career, but it's, and I feel like the loneliness wasn't in the career, like the writers in the room, the loneliness was in the marriage. And,
That's certainly at least 50% true in that. Yeah, I mean, I still go out and get lonely when I'm away from home reporting a story, but it's a very different sensation when you're in a happy marriage and you can call home and say, I'm lonely. I've been at a party with strangers.
And it's helpful, too, that, someone can have a bad marriage and then they can have a really great marriage. I think it's just an uplifting point to make. And you certainly didn't have any problems about whether your second husband would read the book, because he certainly comes off as a...
Really? But my next memoir... No, it's a good thing to dangle over someone's head. You really wouldn't want me to write a really negative book about you, would you? So you do the dishes tonight.
And tomorrow. So from The Orchid Thief to The Library Book to Joyride, you've always been drawn to obsession, whether it's someone else's obsession or your own. Can you talk about what is it about obsession that is so fascinating?
It is the heightened, it's almost like using all the colors in the paint box. You see things dramatized, exaggerated, kind of heightened in a way that makes them really fun to write about. Even though we don't all share the same obsessions, I do think everyone can sort of relate to the idea of being very single-minded about something. And I would argue that probably most of us have one or two things that would fall into the category of an obsession. Even if it's something that seems, not a hobby, like say you're just obsessed with politics, or you're, obsessed with your kids, or whatever it is. I think there are things that we all find to organize our lives around, and that becomes very meaningful and makes decisions for you about how you spend your time, the people you want to associate with. It's fascinating to be in a subculture of people who all share an obsession. And part of it is I'm very interested in writing about obsessions that I don't share at all. I mean, when I started The Orchid Thief, I thought, like, orchids are kind of ugly. Like, I don't get it. And so it became part of the challenge for me, was thinking, why would anyone like this? And when I worked for Rolling Stone, I became famous as being the person who never liked to write about the bands I liked. I only liked writing about the bands I didn't like, because I would think, why would anyone like them? Like, I want to understand why people like this band when I think they're terrible. And it was like trying to I know it's weird, but I got a lot of pleasure in thinking, I've got to unlock this. I've got to figure this out, because these people can't all be wrong. There has to be something that I'm missing that will make me understand why this connects for so many people. And it was, to be honest, it was really fun. It was part of the adventure, was like, it was a puzzle that I was puzzling out. Why does this work? Why are you obsessed with taxidermy? Like, what could possibly motivate you to want to stuff raccoons? And, in a way, it's more intriguing to me than writing about the things that I am interested in, because those, I just think, well, those are obviously good things to be interested in, right? I mean, that's the way we all relate to the things we're obsessed with. So
I think also the obsession seemed to create moral ambiguity. Like, the person who's obsessed with books burns the library, and the person who's obsessed with orchids, does. It seems like there's a way that obsession blurs the lines of morality and makes people make really interesting and strange choices.
yeah, absolutely. I think we're kind of in this heightened sense of ourselves, and you make decisions. I mean, it was funny with the orchid thief. There were so many people who would confide to me, like, that they actually had smuggled orchids. They were like little old ladies, and they'd say, I have to admit to you, the last time I went to Costa Rica, I stuck 4 endangered orchids in my bra. And, and I would think, oh my God, don't tell me this. I'm going to have to report you. But, and they weren't criminals, but they were in the service of their passion. And that's really, I think, maybe a word to use instead of obsession, or they're somewhat interchangeable. But I think in the service of their passion, the normal boundaries of behavior got a little wobbly. And that's very interesting.
It is interesting. I was thinking when you first started talking that it sounds like obsession is a drug. And this kind of behavior is, it's addiction behavior, when that you
100%.
Yeah.
I think obviously the difference is there's no self-harm that comes of it, but the sort of singular focus is the same.
Yep.
And I think humans are sort of wired to care deeply about something, and much of the time it's something very benign. People care deeply about their family or their community. I mean, we all have things that we see in very high relief, but it often then has, there are these other things that we get deeply interested in, and then we feel motivated beyond our normal behavior to service those.
Right.
I mean, people
priorities,
will,
it creates priorities and reorders the.
Well, certainly people will spend a lot of money. I mean, that's one of the most sort of obvious ways it's similar to an addiction, is people, and the number of people when I've written about these different passions who've sort of confessed to me, I never tell my wife how much I spend on, fill in the blank.
Bonsai trees.
Yeah.
That was my husband.
Yeah. And that's a very common refrain. This is what I really care about, and I sort of kind of can't stop myself.
That's how it is. I know that people are eager to ask Susan their own questions, so I'm going to ask one more and then let you line up at this microphone and have at it. But so your work has spanned a lot of forms: long-form journalism, cultural criticism, biography, and now memoir. Is there another form you're hungry to explore? Do you think you'll ever write fiction? And what are you working on next?
You know, I love fiction. I read fiction almost exclusively in my spare time. In a perfect world, I would somehow feel confident that I could write fiction, but I two things. One is I enjoy learning about the real world too much, and I keep feeling like, well, there's another story to tell, and it's a real story, and there's
Historical fiction.
yeah. So my guess is that I probably won't, although I'm working on a television adaptation of the library book, and that is fiction. So I'm sort of exercising some of that desire in that form. But I love fiction so much, and my standards would be so high that I suspect I could never match it. What's next for me, believe it or not, I'm starting a new book, and
I'm shocked.
I'm a little shocked because after each book, it's like after you give birth, you say, never again, like, no way. And then 5 minutes later, you go, oh, I want to do that again. And I was not looking for another book idea, and I absolutely stumbled on one, and I kept saying, no, 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 no. And finally, I just gave in. So, and I don't want to say too much about it yet, but it's a story about a very unusual building that I kind of stumbled upon. So, and I've always wanted to write a book about a building, which in a sense I did with the library book, but this is a little different.
Okay, that's a teaser. I can't wait. Would someone like to ask a question? There's that mic.
This is great fun, and I really look forward to reading the book. I was just going to say that I'm an avid reader of your blog, and if people don't know about it, they should read it. And I'm constantly fascinated by the number of books that you read and that you talk about in your blog, as well as the streaming series that you've been watching. And my question is, how do you find the number of hours in the day to be a writer and to consume the amount of literature and other kinds of things that you do? Thanks.
I sometimes wonder that too, because a lot of times, and by the way, what Cindy's referring to is my Substack, which is called Wordy Bird, and it's been a lot of fun to do it. But sometimes I'll start listing what I've watched recently, and I'm horrified. And I think, I watch so much television, and I do audiobooks, which means that I can read a lot more than if I were reading physical books, because I'm listening kind of all day. Anytime I'm driving, I'm listening. And it's actually, I would say it's doubled the number of books that I can consume, which I love. I think I'm sort of mystified, though. I mean, when I say to people, "What's good to watch on television?" and they'll give me a list of 20 shows, and I've seen them all. And I think, do I stay
Tell
up
us what
all
are some
night?
of your
Do I stay up
favorites.
all night?
What are some of your favorites?
Well, I am right now watching this wonderful show called For All Mankind, which is on Apple, and it's a sort of an alternate history sort of show about if the Russians had landed on the moon before us, and it's fantastic. It's absolutely a fabulous show. Before that, I watched 5 seasons of a British show called Top Boy about drug dealers in a housing estate in London, and it's amazing. I do really watch a lot of TV. I'm not bragging. I'm not bragging. I really
don't watch
do.
much, but I did just watch Adolescence. Did you watch that?
Yes, it was particularly striking to me. I binged it on a flight, and the minute I landed, I called my husband and I said, "Drop whatever you're doing, go watch this immediately." But it was also very interesting having written The American Man, age 10, and, you know, seeing obviously the boy I wrote about was not a troubled kid, but the show was amazing.
It really was.
I think it's the best thing I've seen on television in years.
I'm so glad since I don't watch much, I'm so lucky that I watched that
So
one.
what are you doing with your time? I mean, I don't get it.
Well, I actually read, not exaggerating, 4 or 5 books a week, sometimes more.
Wow.
Yeah, so I can, I review for a lot of places, and I just really love to read. So but I take a different, like, I kind of don't do I don't read the newspaper barely. I don't listen to NPR anymore. I don't watch shows. I just read, So if you're going to read 30 books a month, you really have to just read. But it's definitely, when we were talking about obsession and addiction, I'm totally addicted to it. I can't stop
addiction.
reading. So
Yes, sir.
Hello, hi. I love the humor in your writing, and I will confess that at the height of COVID, a good friend of mine and I were sending back and forth a lot of your very candid tweets as well. So I feel like your humor in all forms has brightened up many people's lives. But was curious just to hear a little bit about some of your favorite humorists or where you sort of find comedic inspiration.
Well, thank you. That's a huge compliment. The humor, the kind of funny writing that I love the most is not front and center humor writing, but rather the writers who do reported pieces but incorporate a lot of humor in their writing. Well, I think the two people who come to mind are Ian Fraser and Calvin Trillin, who are genuinely hilarious, but it's part of a story about something. And I love the humor pieces in the New Yorker, the ones that are strictly humor, but I find myself enjoying much more though. And, there even is humor in some of the sort of darker writers like John McPhee and Joseph Mitchell, where they know how to be witty or to surprise you with something that's very funny. I think probably Calvin Trillin is the consummate. I mean, he had a book that he wrote many, many years ago. It was a collection of columns he'd done for the New Yorker, where he would just go to different towns in America where someone had gotten murdered and write about the town and the murder, not to solve it in any way, but just sort of telling you what was this scenario.
Doesn't sound like a comic premise.
And yet he's so funny that his descriptions, there's a wit and a kind of twinkle in his writing that even, these were done very seriously and they weren't meant to make fun of anything or make light of anything. These were murders. But he can't help but bring, that's who he is as a person. He's funny, he's droll, and he just sort of looks at the world with a little bit of a wink, and that comes through in the writing. And I tend to prefer that to just straight humor writing. I have to also do a shout out to my friend Patty Marks, who is really brilliant at, writing about stuff, but always is hilarious.
I'm just interested, since you choose such an interesting variety of topics to write about. Looking back earlier in your career, was there any story or piece you didn't write that now looking back on it, you think, oh crap, why didn't I write about that?
Yeah, it's funny because there are two stories that I have a lot of ideas that I've never had the time to do, but there are two stories that I began the reporting and 3. And I can't remember why I didn't continue. And in each case, I feel like I could still go back and do them. And I just don't remember why. I mean, one was about this group of people who live sort of all spread out around the country, but they all share a sourdough starter, and they're like obsessed with this sourdough starter, and they have like a text chain where they're constantly checking in on each other. And the sourdough starter is really old. It's been around for like 100 years. And I don't know if you know, but sourdough starters, you have to take care of them. And if you go out of town, you have to hire a babysitter to feed them. And it's this whole thing. And these people were obsessed. They found yeast in King Tut's tomb, and they were going to try to make a sourdough starter with this yeast from ancient Egypt. And it was really a great story. And I can't remember what happened. Like some scheduling thing interfered. And I feel like, well, if the sourdough starter is still alive, I can go back and do that. So there was never a good reason that I didn't follow through on these. And as a rule, if I start something, I'm generally going to finish it. But I think in all of these cases, it was just something interfered with the time. And in the back of my mind, I thought, well, I'm going to put it aside for now, but I'll come back to it. And now you're making me really anxious and feeling like I really should go back and do them all. And the weird thing is recently I came across, I have all the notes from these stories. So, probably many of the people or characters have moved on or died or changed jobs, or, the story hasn't remained completely static, but everything that I gathered is still relevant.
I just want to put in a quick question. We learn from your memoir that you have kind of a penchant for fashion, and I would like to know about this skirt that you have on.
Oh,
It's so
well.
cool. It's like made out of pieces of blanket or something.
It is. And actually, I was just telling my friend, I've had this for probably 20 years, which makes me kind of proud. You feel like if you can buy something and still like it 20 years later, it means something. It's a Japanese brand called Comme des Garçons. And, it's stood the test of time.
Yes.
And it probably is pieces of blanket. It's probably a horse blanket or something.
Well, when she gets up, you'll see it better.
Hi, Susan. Thanks for coming out tonight. As you go around the country now, reflecting on your career, and talk to readers like us, which work of nonfiction of yours has the most staying power, you find, and why do you think that is?
Wow, that's a good question. I think without a doubt, American Man Age 10, partly because it's been in so many anthologies, and I think because in a sense it's, timeless. I think our curiosity about the life of young people is a constant. But it's funny, I feel like my big surprise has been the library book. And not that I didn't think it would have staying power, but I think, I remember when I first mentioned to someone at my publisher that I wanted to write a book about a library, and the look on their faces was like, that sounds really boring. And so I all along thought, are people just going to think, libraries, it's so dull. And so the reception and the fact that it's continued being sort of actively purchased and read and discussed is a wonderful feeling. And it's interesting because all of these questions about book banning and libraries and are they open, should they be available to everybody, those questions seem in a sense more pressing and current than they were when I wrote the book.
Hello. So the most stunning thing to me about the American Man reporting is that you had one kid that you were told about and it worked out, like with this one kid. So I'm just wondering, do you think that basically any kid could have worked at the end of the day if you spend 2 weeks with them, that anybody would have been fine? And relatedly, like how much time do you spend looking for the right subject on the front end versus now obviously some things like there's, one orchid obsessed guy, so like he's the guy. But in other situations and how important do you think that is versus just this name? I mean, I just find that stunning that you had a 2 week or 3 week deadline for this story, basically 4 weeks, whatever it was, and you were able to, and you just one friend of a friend is okay. Let's do this kid, and it all just worked out.
It's such. I mean, that's such a great question because the universal draws from the specific and vice versa, and so I've often had a topic. I'll give you a perfect example. I wanted to write a piece about life in a trailer park. And this was after Timothy McVeigh had been arrested. And it was said in every single mention of him that he lived in a trailer park. And one day I thought, what does that even mean? Like, I've never been in a trailer park. What does that mean? I want to write a story about what it might feel like to live in a trailer park. So then I thought, well, there are thousands of trailer parks. So all of them are equally sort of prime to be the topic, but no single one, each one is different. So by choosing one, you are defining this very general idea. And I jokingly, though seriously, said to my editor, let's just take a map and a dart and throw a dart, because it felt like I could literally choose anything. Would they be the same story? Absolutely not. And the case with Colin Duffy is I was introduced to 2 10-year-old boys at that time. I met with the one, and he was overly eager to have me write about him. And the mom was overly eager. And I was really worried. And I thought, they're too excited. I want someone who's not as interested in being written about. And then I met the Duffys, and they were really like, if Colin says it's okay with him, it's okay with us. And Colin was like, yeah, whatever. And I thought, okay, now I didn't know the specifics of his life and it was a gamble, but I began by thinking the setup and the ways I can control it to begin with work. He lives in a suburb. His parents are teachers. They're not rich. They're not poor. They're, in as much as I can sort of have a grid of what would work for the story, it fit. But then it was all going to be totally individual. Could it have been like that he was, say, a kid who had no friends and was kind of a drag? Yeah, that could have happened. I couldn't have really sort of factored in for that possibility. So the thing with the trailer park, I mean, I thought I'm into the dartboard kind of concept, but I also thought it's like, I don't have a dart, and let's figure this out. And I said, well, I know of a trailer park in Portland, Oregon, because I used to drive by it all the time. And it's, as far as I know, it's just a typical trailer park. And the only advantage is I know my way around Portland because I used to live there. So why not pick that? I could have picked one in Arkansas, in really anywhere. And then each one is going to change where the story goes. I find that part of those kinds of stories really challenging. You're both defining very specifically the story, but you're trying to have it mean something more universal. So it kind of has to do both things at once. I don't think in advance you're really able to predict. I think you can only see those sort of baseline facts that make it somewhat representative, and then let it be the individual story. But it's a huge challenge for sure. Anyone else?
I think we could take one more, or we could move on to the book signing. Is there a...
Anyone else? One more here.
One more.
I just wanted to ask about buildings and writing about buildings, because that seems like a particular challenge. And maybe how do you, when you want to write about a building, what goes through your mind about how to start about it, how to bring something that's so rock solid to life? That was it. I'm curious on that. Thank you.
When I lived in New York, I used to play this little mental game where I thought, what if someone said to me that for the rest of my writing career, I can only write about my block and nothing else. I can't write about anything beyond my block. And I used to think, well, I could do it. I could find a lifetime's worth of stories on this block. And then I sort of shrank that and thought, all right, what if it's just my building? Could I do it? I'm interested in this. I don't know how I would describe this. I love taking a frame and holding it up and examining what's within that frame. I love saying we're going to sort of freeze time in this moment, or spatially in this space, and just examine it. And, you know, I didn't really think of the library book as a book about a building, but it truly was, because it was very much about the arc of the life of this building, including the, disaster and the fire and the renewal. But I also got fascinated by all the memories that it held and the history that it represented. And, there was something sort of wonderful and slightly sort of supernatural about the idea that I was here, but in 1896, someone else was there. And I took out a book that someone took out in 1940, and that you keep treading in the same path through history. A building, I'm very interested in architecture, so just like the physicality of buildings interests me, but the building I'm writing about has this insane history that included crazy residents and it was built in the 1930s, so it has this arc through time that to me is really interesting, that it's sort of stayed there and time has sort of passed through, and the building is still there, and new residents came in, and it's like a time-lapse photography, and the building is the constant. And the built environment to me is very interesting, and there's a lot of fun, I think, in describing that, so that appeals to me. And I think of buildings as very dynamic, that, they are their contents. So while they seem very concrete and stolid and unchanging, when you think about it, I just loved seeing and learning about the people who lived in my house before I did, and feeling like, that's so wild. Like, we were in the same living room, and they were these kind of people, and we're this kind of people, and how wild that the house has contained all of those stories. So I think it's, there's a kind of permanence of a building and then this river that goes through it, that's this river of time and people that I just love.
Well, I think we should wrap it up. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.